This week, we talk with Sven Morgenroth from NetSparker. In the news segment, the clock is ticking for add-on security. Ransomware looks for a path to branch out. We chat about rating vulns and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Signal Sciences secures the most important web applications, APIs, and microservices of the world's leading companies, protecting over 7,500 applications and 150 billion production requests per week. Signal Sciences Next-Gen WAF and RASP help companies increase security and maintain site reliability without sacrificing velocity, all at the lowest total cost of ownership. Signal Sciences patented technology protects any application against any attack, with integrations into any DevOps toolchain. Signal Sciences, demand more from your WAF. Learn more at signalsciences.com/PSW.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 60, recorded May 6th, 2019. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with Matt Alderman, who's a familiar voice and face, because we have video too, from Business Security Weekly. Hey, Matt.
May the 4th celebrate Cinco de Mayo. We missed them both this weekend. Sorry, I had to get it out.
We missed them both. Well, we've got our co-host John Kinsella here. John, did you help us out on this Star Wars?
I can't help you out there, man. It's the fourth joke, so I've got nothing for you.
Okay, sounds good. I've been watching Star Trek myself, so just a little bit of trolling right there. Before we dive in, register for our upcoming webcasts with Kaseya and observe it by going to securityweekly.com/webcasts. If you have missed any of our previously recorded webcasts, you can find them at securityweekly.com/on-demand. Attending KubeCon and Cloud Native Con Europe 2019 in Barcelona, May 20 to 23rd, 2019. Join your peers at the Cloud Native Transformation Summit 2019, hosted by Sysdig on May 20th. Our very own Matt Alderman will be emceeing the event. Pre-registration is required. You can add it on during your KubeCon and Cloud Native Con registration. Oh, so speaking of added on, that is, I think, the perfect thing for the aptly named Armageddon add-on that happened this week with poor Mozilla and Firefox. Did you guys follow this?
Only through the articles, but it was Arma add-on, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, all I can think.
People this weekend.
A lot of unhappy people, and it's interesting for two aspects. Well, probably for a couple aspects. But on the one hand, Mozilla had announced that, similar to what Chrome had announced back in, I think, October 2010, that Mozilla was going to put some extra scrutiny to their add-ons, essentially saying minification is good for your source, but obfuscating it with the implication that obfuscation is being done to, bypass security controls, to hide nefarious activity that might be going on within an add-on, that Mozilla was going to pay more attention to that, basically improve the security of that ecosystem. Unfortunately, what also happened is they didn't renew an intermediate certificate that, which, because that expired, prevented Firefox add-ons, especially ones that were ad blockers, some other critical ones that a lot of people used, just outright stopped working.
So was this the combination of the two coming together that really created the issue here this weekend?
No, this was unfortunately not quite a combination so much as a coincidence. What really was the issue was that people remain fallible, and for as much as we've been talking about automate all the things, and automation is awesome, whether it's some super cool Kubernetes, massive thing, or just some small automation within SSL labs and Hard-Eyes, people still don't always notice expirations. So sort of like, if you're going to expire certs, maybe just expire them on a Tuesday morning. like 10 a.m. local time with whenever your security team or whenever your DevOps team is working, rather than having them be exactly 6 months or 12 months from now, which just happens to be on like a Friday evening or a Saturday morning or something like that. So it's kind of funny that for as much as we're talking about automation, maybe we should still keep that automation kind to humans and their sleep and working schedules.
Yeah, pretty.
You know,
The force wasn't with them this weekend, is what you.
No force. It was Revenge of the Sith on that one.
For as simple as it sounds to be able to set up that type of what you're just saying was actually an interesting idea there, Mike. Being able to say, I want this search to expire at this particular time of day. The amount of trouble that would take, it would be easier for people who are doing that, for most of those folks, to just monitor the search in the first place. And you know, I'm guilty of this myself in some cases, but it seems like we're not improving on that one as quickly as we can. That's such a basic thing to do, and hopefully they'll learn.
Yeah.
Hopefully others will learn from Firefox's mistake. How about that?
Yes, because and it's interesting, for as many as there's fantastic positive steps with having massive PKI infrastructures, essentially with our end-to-end encryption, things like iMessages being encrypted, other type, SSL everywhere, that to a degree, expiration and not renewing them shows a bit of a brittle side in there. Two quick
Mike,
comments.
I want to go back
go ahead.
to the first one, which was
the
add-ons and obfuscated code. So I get that obfuscation, right, is used to bypass security controls, but some people would say it's also used to protect potentially some intellectual property. So how do you address this if you're trying to protect maybe some IP or some other things that's in that code? Does Mozilla have a workaround for this in that case, or is it just like you can't obfuscate code at all, or it's not an add-on?
Yeah. So in this case, that the broader approach I'd take there is know your threat model and know the difference, know what you can and can't do once code goes client side. So essentially, we can joke that minification and JavaScript itself is already, a self-obfuscating language, but I'll leave that joke aside for Perl. But in this case, more seriously, there are different patterns that you would design into your app to protect your IP if you're putting it into the client. So for example, rather than putting a lot of decision making or a lot your full algorithm for if you're trying to do feature X, what you would do is maybe have your client in the add-on in the browser be a very small shim that's just making a request back to your server that's giving you that thumbs up, thumbs down if it's like an ad blocker type of decision. That's a little bit different, perhaps. I can't off the top of my head think of a better design for, a better example for that. But I think if we were going to talk about protecting client-side code, that's going down that route of DRM, and that's more specifically for plain video and content protection aspects, rather than saying, I'm going to put either something that is security sensitive into a browser add-on where somebody could reverse engineer it, or I'm going to put intellectual property. On the first half, it goes that, there's the Kirchhoff's principle, a well-known principle in cryptography that says the security of your system shouldn't be any weaker if your attacker has full knowledge of it. It's mostly intended to be talk about, crypto algorithms, but I think in terms of browser add-ons, the same sentiment is here for those as well. So this is actually a really good step, I think, for Mozilla to be doing, and that if you have intellectual property, that's a different architecture and design approach. You're going to have to evaluate whether or not you have just a small add-on calling back to a server, and that's where you're running your algorithm. You're introducing potentially latency, things like that, though. But in terms of security, I think pretty much 100%, I'm all for this. And there's maybe one or two exceptions that might come in, but off the top of my head, I can't think of them.
Yeah, because it does potentially create an impact in the way that you architect the plugin, and potentially, like you said, the latency or the performance of that plugin, if there's certain proprietary stuff that always has to make that round trip back to the server.
Right. And in a way, it's not necessarily always bad to be pushing things onto the client. So, for example, the latest iOS update, um, Apple decided, finally they took out support for the do not track header because unfortunately the standard didn't really go in the broad direction that the standard's body really intended. But what they've done is Safari, Mozilla, Chrome to a degree do have their own sort of ad blocking or anti-tracking countermeasures. And what Safari has done is actually move their ML model for that onto the client side itself. And that was a choice, not so much to, as a worry from reverse engineering, but that was a choice to be privacy preserving, to sort of collect data and make those decisions on the client rather than actually make those callbacks to the server. So there's a lot of interesting ways we can talk about this in terms of both just threat model as well as what are you actually trying to design and optimize for here in your architecture.
Yeah. Yeah, that kind of ties into, not to skip too far ahead, but this one from Apple on the removal of the parental control app removal, right? They say it's for privacy reasons because they want to protect it. But I don't know if any of you have tried to use their parental controls. It's horrid. It absolutely stinks.
Yeah, so I have to admit I haven't had the chance to use that because I think my cat knows my passwords anyways. But the broader point here is, or a different point here is also considering what are the other threat models, because MDM is super powerful. And I would also add to this that parental controls can also be abused in other scenarios with like intimate partner violence or those types of scenarios where, tracking an ex or tracking someone else and they don't even realize it. So there are, and this is an area like, for example, EFF has been talking about a lot recently. So it is interesting to look at this from the perspective of there's an ease of use aspect that you were just calling out, Matt. Like, not easy to use at all. It's a pain, but also how do we balance that and what do we want to pull into our threat models in terms of here is a sort of consumer level solution that's an enterprise MDM that's maybe a bit more control over that device than was expected.
Yeah, I mean, I get the issues on both sides, but
Yeah.
when I have my two boys under my Apple ID and I want to enforce certain parental controls on their phones, Apple does not make it easy. It is just a royal pain to deal with. And so you would look to a third-party app maybe to help just manage that situation a little better. Because Apple, what they say, look, is anybody over, I think, age of 13 should have their own Apple ID. Well, no, because you need a credit card if you're going to do any purchases. Why the heck would I give my kids Apple IDs, my credit card information, so they can go willy-nilly? It's just the whole mechanism is a mess on that side. And then they take out some of these popular apps that parents are trying to use to actually manage that a little easier. So I have a little grief with this one.
Yeah, I think that also speaks to, you're just asking about, Firefox and add-ons, can they expose certain APIs or certain types of primitives or components to make add-ons easier, better? It's sort of the same thing here. How much can Apple expose particular APIs so that third-party apps can actually build a better user interface and a better user experience? Or do they just want to keep these APIs, self-contained, so only Apple is the sole arbiter of how they are used, as well as, to a degree, diminishing that user experience?
The pros and cons of the ecosystem.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, at least I like to think of Apple as providing good user experience. And if they're having, either they've done an insignificant job making this easy for parents to use, or that the problem is actually difficult enough that even Apple can't do it right. I'm guessing it's not the latter because we have some other applications out there actually doing this. But then turn around and look, and this isn't just parents having this issue, right? This is enterprises have this issue. MDM's been a big space for a while. It's one of those things that a lot of people are starting to ask for this, especially at larger enterprises, and we need to somehow make this easier for people to be able to do.
Yeah, I think that it's a good segue. I'm going to steal that for a moment for some articles you highlighted, Matt, especially about like we're really talking about like secure software design, and we're having this conversation around essentially engineering trade-offs and how would we architect a particular feature. But here's an article that's talking about a bunch of different things, including a lefter than left, which I suppose is more human than human aspect of our DevOps approach to software.
Yeah, I mean, what struck me about this article is I think we all know that thinking about security earlier in the software development lifecycle is important, okay? And we know we're all struggling with the concept of just basic shift left from a security into the software development lifecycle, okay? So now this article says, no, we got to be even lefter than left, and we got to start thinking about this as the design component. And my question to you guys who are in the middle of designing code and supporting products, I'm not, is how feasible is this to move security design further left than we've probably ever thought about doing it? Does the process, does the skill set of my developers, does the technology even potentially exist to really make this worthwhile or not? I get the promise of it, but I'm not sure that how feasible it is to actually do it.
Yeah, a lot of times when I look at, go ahead, John. What? Yeah.
Well, I was going to say it's feasible. So it becomes, I think the interesting part where the head shake for me was what you just said, Matt, is it's not so much, I mean, part of it's going to be technology, but part of it, I mean, comes back to like IBM has their phrase, I think they coined it originally, design thinking. I know they've really embraced it and they market the hell out of it nowadays, but that idea of, you should always be thinking about not just the product, but what is the design? How is it designed like? How is it being used and interacted with? And this comes back to specifically this around, both on this particular topic, as well as Mike was talking earlier about some of the, well, we might think of them as edge use cases around why you'd want to have security monitoring on a phone, right? If there's an abusive relationship going on or something else, when the people developing these things are, going through the process, they're probably not thinking of those, which are to them an edge case. But it comes down to it could be something simple or like playing protection poker or some of the more common sort of how do we just flesh out on a whiteboard what potentially could be done with this application. And I think by starting there and having some of those initial experiments, I'll say, I think that gets people starting down that path of thinking that way and starting to think then through, okay, well, now we've gone that, how can we improve this process even more?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is more a people process issue than it is technology, John. I fully get that. But we're having a hard enough time to get security to the table to have a conversation with development on things like doing monitoring and control, right? Just basic visibility control stuff. Do we really have an opportunity to go even further left than that, the concept of this article, and have security architects and software architects sitting down before a project starts and think about the security ramifications as part of that design? Maybe that's actually easier than some of the other discussions in the DevOps pipeline.
I think a little bit what I see is this is where if we get into sort of the naming of things, like application security is a lot of that shift left. And that's where, I think the phrase I tried to use last time is like AppSec is an emergent property of a good DevOps or DevSecOps pipeline. So you're shifting left or even call it spending left, because that's where either tools, whether they're open source or commercial, are going earlier on into your dynamic analysis, static analysis, fancy IDEs. But when we get into the product security side of things, that's where it is a people challenge. And that's where I do think it's still feasible if we can get into a richer conversation that goes beyond just what are the technical controls and really focus on those first two questions of a threat model. What are you trying to build and what could go wrong? And then, of course, the third part is, what are you going to do about it? I think this article is kind of calling out the aspect of talking then to designers, to architects, to not about cross-site scripting and SQL injection and CSRF and those types of things, but you're trying to build an MDM solution, or you're trying to build X, and these are your different user populations. How does this affect them? And I think that is I think that conversation has to happen with people. I don't know of any good tools. John, you mentioned like there are some good like card games out there. Even like Microsoft has their Elevation of Privilege card game as well. There's a couple other approaches to that in the sense of a richer threat model of of how to do threat modeling. But I think if there's something that we're really missing that's going to make it hard for this to be feasible is a lack of tooling to be able to make this scale to any meaningful degree.
Yep. Do you want to lead that into my next article, which is trust the stack and not the people?
Yeah, I think that's so. Yeah, my whole premise was just saying we got to trust and rely on people. But yeah, so check this article out. Trust the stack now, and the stack will take care of us all. So I don't know, John, Matt, what do you guys think of this?
Yeah, I mean, look, there are certain things from a technology stack that I think can help us build a level of trust with our applications that take some of the reliance off of people. But last week I was at the Global Cyber Innovation Summit, and it was an event in Baltimore, Maryland, where they brought together about 200 CISOs from across the industry. They brought in industry experts, they brought in government guys. And one of the big topics out of that was application security, integrity of open source, provenance of your software, because we're borrowing software components to build our next generation of applications. So when you think about this concept of trust the stack, what are you talking about? If you're talking about the endpoint and the orchestrator and the containers running on top of that and some of the tools you integrate, maybe. Are you talking about the open source and some of the code that's coming in? I think there's a lot of challenges here with getting to this concept of trusting the stack and not the people, because there's a lot of issues we haven't addressed yet in the software supply chain, I don't think, that allows us to create that level of trust in all those components yet.
Yeah, I think we already saw that the stack maybe failed the people, or maybe the people failed the stack with that intermediate cert that Firefox didn't renew. But yeah, I think that aspect of there's a whole realm of AppSec presentations on domain name squatting and typo squatting, different like NPMs or pip or package names that these open source tools use. So on the one hand, you could say, sure, somebody made a mistake and made a typo, but if that stack is just pulling random packages and all these crazy dependency graphs of for all these open source tools, it's sort of like trust the stack is going to grow, but do you really, it's 10 a.m. Do you know where your stack is? Do you know what your stack is actually doing?
Yeah, exactly. Right. Which is why, John, I'm going to go back to some of our old conversations about aspects of understanding what behavior looks like in the application. If I know known good, does that allow me to put some protections in place? It's partially at a different level and layer, though, than all the underlying components of your enterprise stack as things move around. I think there's a potential promise, but I don't think it's an easy one to solve just because there's so many parts right now.
So I think this ties back partially between this one and then also the last topic of the human aspect of things. So yeah, behavior if you have an existing application, you can monitor its behavior, you can understand what it's doing, you can either do the basic stuff or say, hey, at 3 o'clock in the morning, it's going to run a cron job, we're expecting that to happen. You can get more and more sophisticated around what you do there. I think it comes back to, though, also when we start thinking about those protection poker style games, which I think really are what those games, they're not so much showing you the answers, they're saying, here's your first step. It's almost like an icebreaker in a way, right, from a security icebreaker for a developer. But that same concept now, like, let's not just talk about SQLi or cross-site or our standard sort of WASP things, but also go, okay, hey, what have we included? What packages have those included? How often are they updated? How many stars do they have on GitHub? In other words, are they an active, popular project? We need a Mongo database driver. Should I be using MGO or maybe look at something else that has more users behind it, right? So these are the type of questions which have to be asked, not just go and grab that first thing. And then the second part of that is the review, right? Coming back, and I know these are always super difficult to get time for, but particularly in these type of environments where we are trusting someone else to have that framework for us, we have to go back through and review every, at least let's say 6 months. Okay, any security issues in there we're not aware of? Have they, released a new version of a product or a new version of the package with a different version or a different GitHub tree? Are they telling us there's going to be big changes coming up pretty soon? Some of these sort of, really in a way, they are sort of modern day hygiene. These type of things have to be done in modern code. We've become very lucky, I will say, that we have these really great frameworks that we can now leverage to do some of these cool things, but that doesn't just allow us to completely wipe our hands or wash our hands. We now have to start thinking about when do we go back through and reevaluate or look at them, and then also making sure when we design our code that our code is not really tightly coupled to those frameworks, or at least when possible, that we're able to have some level of flexibility in what we choose and how.
Yeah, I think the tooling here through the process allows us to build more trust with the underlying components, so we catch the things that we should catch, and it allows things to go through that are okay to go through, which allows humans to spend maybe more time on designing up front, or maybe reviewing where things are and whether we should continue to use these libraries or change them out. But I don't know that you automate all aspects of the human element in this process chain.
No, and I
It's not
think
worth
we
the
also,
effort.
yeah, it's not worth the effort. And we also see that the tech stacks themselves are also introducing new ways to make mistakes. But by the same token, it's also more helpful for those stacks to help go back and constrain things. So examples are, for example, like AWS. It's notorious that here is yet another S3 bucket, or here's yet another Elasticsearch that's public that should have been made private. So AWS has done some work to make that mistake a lot more obvious and a lot more difficult to do. Same thing with subdomain takeovers. That's a whole subcategory of, especially lots of people make tons of money off of bug bounties with all these orphaned subdomains in Roku, AWS, a lot of these cloud-based providers. And AWS, for example, also has gone and made that the impact, or made it a lot harder for subdomain takeover to happen. So these stacks aren't actually a panacea, and it could be totally the same thing when we talked with Larry last week. Just adopting a stack doesn't make you a DevOps. Just adopting a stack and trusting it blindly isn't the right way to go. We still need people to be some part of it. It's just, I think what we're talking about is where can we emphasize those people's attention so that we can actually deal with the interesting design aspects and those open-ended, discussions about how we're going to approach this, rather than just ticking all the boxes like, yeah, we forgot to make this S3 public bucket private and so on.
Yeah, and I think this ties in really interesting to this Bugcrowd's vulnerability rating taxonomy, right? Because when you look at this list and you look at the P1s and the P2s, there's a whole lot of stack configuration stuff in here, right? The server security misconfiguration, server side injection components. There's a lot of components here that are very stack related, right? Just to the point is, yeah, we can automate certain aspects of this, but there's so much in the stack that you have to trust. And you look at this criticality rate and you're like, oh my gosh, that's a lot of work to continue to build that trust as you're deploying applications into this new stack.
Yeah, and I think the couple things I like about the Bugcrowd's VRT is just it's nice and simple. We've talked about a bunch of path traversal as well as some other exploits that have come on over the last couple of weeks. And they all have here's a CVSS, 9.2 versus a 9.3, a 7.6. And it's good to have CVSS as kind of a standard way to talk about things. But VRT I like for that aspect of simple prioritization 1 through 5. And it's also a bigger bucket in the sense of, here's this big misconfiguration, that service misconfiguration. Here's a couple nuances, a couple different ways it manifests that's important to call out. But it's just a nice way to say, if we're talking about security teams or DevOps teams that have to respond to a slew of vulns, what do you prioritize? Like, what should you actually tackle first? Because you have a limited amount of time. That VRT is just a great way to be able to talk about these vulns in a pretty standard way rather than getting confused by terms and things like that. So thumbs up. And I really wish that more pen testing reports and more things would align themselves to something like the VRT, more so than the overly generic or overly broad aspect of the OWASP top 10, or the way too detailed CWE, and there are 600 different entries in it.
Yep.
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to go over this really. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say,
Okay.
I thought this was a really good way to summarize different aspects of these different types of vulnerabilities in the application. Which ones are app specific, which ones are infrastructure specific, and help you prioritize which ones to resolve first.
Yeah, and I threw it on there because it's now you mentioned app and infrastructure, but now we've also got cars, and so they actually have some new categories for any of you diving into a CAN bus or infotainment systems. There are now entries called out in their VRT for it. I think we're also going to have to summarize our news segment. Anything else, real quick, that was jumping to the top of your mind, John?
Yeah,
and Matt?
I had one thing on this Git repository asking for a ransom.
Oh yeah.
The other big topic that came out of discussions last week was ransom is not just about encrypting the data and asking for a ransom. It is now deleting your data, which creates this really interesting recovery component that I don't think organizations are really cognizant of. It's one of those domains we forget about in the NIST cybersecurity framework is recovery. And so what you're seeing now is these ransomware attacks are actually, they're not encrypting their data. They're literally deleting their data and forcing the ransom to come through. And there were even cases where they're not even giving you, even after you pay, you're not getting your data back. This is a really scary thing for organizations that I think have to be cognizant, not only of their repositories, but other data, that you've got to have good backups because these types of attacks are going to continue to increase.
You've got to have good, and you have to actually exercise and test that backup, preferably in a non-stressful situation. So it's really a call back to that process of, do you have a process for rotating your certs when they expire? Cool. You have a disaster recovery plan, backups. Have you actually ever restored any of them? Because that's an actual real test of whether you really have backups or not.
It seems like, in a way, a lot of these things we're talking about, we need to revisit a capability maturity model from a security point of view or from an application security point of view. A lot of these type of things you're just talking through, Mike, is, do we have document A through Q? As people go through and actually think about these things, you start off, and again, that document is, the first few revisions of it are really sort of basic. Yes, we will back up, we will restore from G drive or whatever have you. And then as over more and more bumps in the night happen, that gets more refined. But it seems like there needs to be a maturity model document, or a maturity model for not just development itself, but for the rest of the organization.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's us also part of your design. What have you designed for your tools, and does your stack even support this in a way? I will say it's kind of funny to say we're deleting Git repos, and because ideally Git should be easy to recover and restore, being decentralized. But it's also those situations of, you kind of have to shrug and say people are clever and creative about the different types of mistakes they make within their infrastructure.
True.
So I think with that, we are going to take a quick break, and then we're going to return with our interview of the week.